So here's the deal. I'm sure you guys are all as surprised as I am that I have way too much stuff to get through today, but there is no way I'm finishing this. And on top of that, we've got a fire drill. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get as far as I think I can get. And then when I go home later, I'll record the last part. But the last part of this includes like a pretty important caveat. So if you're going to listen to the first part, you should find time during the week to listen to that last part. Because it is a big, it's really as a whole that this, for me, this all kind of holds together. So just wanted to give you guys a heads up. This will abruptly end at some point, and I won't be done. I'm certain of it. So, all right. Can someone pray for us before we get going?
Sure. Father, I want to thank you so much for this morning. Thank you for this opportunity to gather. And Lord, I do just ask that you be with Dom, that you would give him clarity, give him wisdom, and that, Father, as he goes through this, that you would help him to pull out and emphasize the things that you would have him to do, and that you would give us ears to hear and hearts to receive what it is you have this morning. And I ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Thank you. Yes. Amen to that. So there's an outline of the whole session. We've been camped out in this, what we've been calling the age of the reader for a while. And last time we started in with the obstacles to interpretation. We talked last time about the obstacle of language. And that was rooted in what we called the postmodern knowledge principle, which was basically that really there was no real grounds for knowledge that we could appeal to. Today, we're getting into another obstacle to communication, which is the obstacle of interest. And that has a lot more to do with what's called the postmodern political principle. And that's all about power. So the bulk of today's session is going to be centered around what's called the hermeneutics of suspicion. And the hermeneutics of suspicion comes about because of the assumption or understanding that essentially our interest is under everything and motivates all claims to truth, all forms of law, et cetera, et cetera. And we'll get into that. So that's kind of where we're going. This entire paradigm of suspicious explanation of the hermeneutics of suspicion can be traced back to three important figures: Marx, Nietzsche, and Freud. And so we're going to spend a decent amount of time on their thought at the beginning of today, just so you guys can see how like these principles like emerged in their thought. That's where it started. And then we can see how it kind of filters down into their kind of like philosophical errors. So one thing that Thistleton said that I thought was helpful was contrasting the sort of pre-modern, modern, and postmodern eras, is that he says on the basis of belief in God, in the pre-modern era, trust assumed a kind of methodological role. And then doubt takes that role in the modern era, skepticism, okay? And that's exemplified in Cartesian rationalism. And then finally, in the postmodern era, suspicion assumes for postmodernism what doubt assumed for modernism. So it plays this methodological role. It's like you have to suspect everything. I do think it's worth, we could get into this a lot more. I do think it's worth at least noting that the kind of suspicious hermeneutic is largely related to the death of God that Nietzsche kind of talked about. And essentially, when there was an assumption that there was some kind of like uniting principle that held everything together, then there is hope that you can access that, right? There's hope that you can have in some way have access to meaning, have some access to that ordering principle. But when that goes away, when everything's reduced to chaos, then that hope is kind of taken away. And that's where Nietzsche lands, and he's trying to figure out what to do with that. So where it leads him is that you can't make any meaningful truth claims. There's not that ordering principle to appeal to. And so he says, well, his worldview is that, as we'll see, his worldview is that the world is the will to power. And so what you do is just essentially try and move forward and embrace life as he actually finds it. But it's profoundly anti-theistic in its sort of origins. So that previous worldview where there was an assumption that there was an ordering principle of the universe, that you could make meaningful truth claims. Nietzsche and Foucault after him kind of, they come to believe that all claims to truth, any truth claim, is nothing but a disguised attempt to legitimate uses of power. So Anthony Thistleton, back in 1995, he wrote that with the rise of the postmodern notions of the self, of language and meaning, and of society, this issue has become perhaps a more far-reaching cause for disbelief about claims to truth on the part of Christian theology than older, more tired appeals to materialist worldviews. So he's saying that, you know, the traditional sort of objections to Christianity were coming from like atheist, empiricist philosophers who challenge things like miracles. He says now, in the postmodern world, that's not what people are challenging so much anymore. It's all about things power, looking at Christianity as an oppressive power system, essentially. He says that's kind of replaced the older forms of, or older reasons of disbelief in our current era. And I would say, in my observation, that's certainly correct. So he says that Nietzsche, Derrida, and Foucault have as their project to unmask all systems of reason as systems of persuasion, and that in their system, all thought that pretends to discern truth is but an expression of the will to power, even to domination of those making the truth claims over those who are being addressed by them. Okay, it's all about the will to power. So this what we're calling the hermeneutics of suspicion, which is rooted in the thought of the masters of suspicion. Paul Ricoeur is this hermeneutical thinker who coined that terminology, and he did it in his book, in a book that he wrote in 1965 called Freud and Philosophy. And essentially, it's pretty well agreed upon that postmodern thought can be traced back to these three thinkers. That there's a line from these guys to Derrida and Foucault, and then to all the sort of theory that comes after that. So Ricoeur says that if we go back to the intention they had in common, we find in it the decision to look upon the whole of consciousness primarily as false consciousness. They thereby take up again, each in a different manner, the problem of Cartesian doubt, right? So Descartes wondered how we could know stuff. They take up that same question, but whereas he trusted the rational thinker, Ricoeur says they carry that to the very heart of the Cartesian stronghold. The philosopher trained in the school of Descartes knows that things are doubtful, that they are not such as they appear, but he does not doubt that consciousness as such, or sorry, he does not doubt that consciousness is such as it appears to itself. So the one thing I can trust is that I'm thinking. Therefore, my consciousness, I can trust that fact that I'm conscious. It gives me something to hold on to, right? But since Marx, Nietzsche, and Freud, this too has become doubtful. We can't even trust our own consciousness. We're self-deceived. All right, so that's what leads to the kind of suspicion that we'll be talking about today. So I do want to run through these guys as quickly as I can, but there's, to give you a sense of where suspicion comes from, I kind of have to spend a little bit of time here. So the first one to talk about is Marx. He was the first kind of, we'll talk about them chronologically. Marx comes first. And for Marx, he frames everything in terms of class conflict, particularly as a relationship between oppressor and oppressed. So one of the first claims that he makes in Communist Manifesto is this. He says, the history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles. Freeman and slave, patrician and plebeian, lord and serf, guildmaster and journeyman, in a word, oppressor and oppressed, stood in constant opposition to one another, carried on an uninterrupted, now hidden, now open fight. So Marx's entire worldview is framed in this conflict paradigm. Okay, so that comes to be really important in postmodern thought more broadly. He makes other comments like to a similar effect. Like he says, hitherto every form of society has been based, as we've already seen, on the antagonism of oppressing and oppressed classes. He says one fact is common to all past ages, namely the exploitation of one part of society by the other. So for him, this is like the dominant lens through which we look at society.
Don, what did he feel like he was doing by offering this worldview?
We'll get to that. I think, yeah, well, I'll get to that when I'm taping this at home. There are some responses. They don't apply Alison Scott Bowman says that they needed a dose of their own hermeneutics of suspicion, applied to their own worldview. Nobody wants to apply that kind of stuff to themselves. Okay. And that is important. But nonetheless, so Marx says, so he talks about the proletariat, which is like the working classes. He sees them as just completely disenfranchised. They're in control of almost nothing in their lives. And he says, law, morality, religion are to him, to the proletarian, law, morality, religion are to him so many bourgeois prejudices, behind which lurk in ambush just as many bourgeois interests. Okay, law, morality, religion, it's all just bourgeois interests veiled in those other forms. He sees interest kind of what's actually driving all of those things, that they don't have integrity in and of themselves. So kind of like addressing the bourgeois class in his manifesto, he says, your very ideas are but the outgrowth of the conditions of your bourgeois production and bourgeois property, just as your jurisprudence is but the will of your class made into law for all. So for him, ideas, all of that stuff is driven in this really deterministic way by material conditions, economic conditions, and stuff like that. So again, so basically what it comes down to is no systems or truth claims are taken at face value, but only as these manifestations of veiled power interests by these classes in conflict with one another.
Was it just that, but I mean, part of that was true.
All of these guys have insights that are correct. Yep.
Yeah, and so was there no one else who was highlighting that this was happening?
It's not like he's completely by himself, but he was such a powerful thinker and communicator that he really became the sort of like symbol of this way of thinking. Like there's nobody who's been as influential as him in articulating this way of looking at the world. He's just extremely influential. I mean, still today, yeah, massively influential. So,
and did he see the oppressed masses, which were badly oppressed, as having absolutely no responsibility or no ability to respond at all?
Their response is so their consciousness is driven by material conditions. He doesn't think that apart from an overthrow of the systems that currently exist, that they can do anything to improve their lot. So for Marx, with this conflict paradigm, what he needs to do is he needs to awaken their consciousness to how badly oppressed they are so that they can then revolt and forcibly overthrow the existing oppressive structures. That's his solution. So that's what he calls for at the end of the manifesto. He says, he's talking about the Communist League that he's writing this manifesto for. He says, the communists disdain to conceal their views and aims. They openly declare that their ends can be attained only by the forcible overthrow of all existing social conditions. Let the ruling classes tremble at the communistic revolution. The proletarians have nothing to lose but their chains. They have the world to win. Proletarians of all countries unite, right? That's how he concludes Communist Manifesto. And I think that's a pretty logical conclusion of the worldview he's working with, right? If it all comes down to will to power and class conflict, then what other recourse do you have but the forcible overthrow of those conditions, okay? So it's a logical conclusion of the paradigm he's working with. So you can see suspicion operative there, right? It's class interest that's manifesting itself in all these different ways, like law, morality, religion. It's just a way to kind of like maintain and legitimate your own power, your own place in society. Okay, so Nietzsche, and you can also see how like in the paradigm of class conflict, like Nietzsche's will to power, he like anticipates that will to power perspective, that everything is kind of power in an antagonistic relationship. So Nietzsche is the one, he comes a little bit after Marx. He coins this phrase, the will to power, which is basically my way of describing it. It's like it's characterized by strength, by vitality, virility. It's the tendency towards mastery, overcoming, expansion. It looks like transcending one's circumstances to something better. It's about achieving more than had been accomplished before, producing new possibilities out of like creative force, creative energy. That's my best way of kind of filling out the concept of what the will to power is. What it's certainly not is weak, humble, lowly, servile, or domesticated. For Nietzsche, that stuff's all a no to life. And so he says in his book Beyond Good and Evil, he says, to refrain from injuring, abusing, or exploiting one another, to equate another person's will with our own. In a certain crude sense, this can develop into good manners between individuals if the preconditions are in place. But, he says, if we were to try to take this principle further and possibly even make it a basic principle of society, it would immediately be revealed for what it is, a will to deny life, a principle for dissolution and decline. He says, we must think through the reasons for this and resist all sentimental frailty. Life itself, in its essence, means appropriating, injuring, overpowering those who are foreign and weaker, oppression, harshness, forcing one's own forms on others, incorporation, and at the very least, at the very mildest, exploitation. He says, but why should we keep using this kind of language that has from time immemorial been infused with slanderous intent? He's like, why are we referring it in such bad terms? So he says, even the social body whose individuals, as we've just assumed above, treat one another as equals, and this happens in a healthy aristocracy. He says, if it's not moribund, if it's not dying, it must do to other bodies everything that the individuals within it refrain from doing to one another, right? It will have to be the will to power incarnate. It will want to grow, to reach out around itself, pull towards itself, gain the upper hand, not out of some morality or immorality, but because it is alive and because life simply is the will to power. Okay, that's Nietzsche. Nietzsche is if you look back at every sermon I have ever preached, it's like it's the starkest antithesis to like Nietzsche's worldview. Like I have found in Nietzsche like my foil. I think his worldview is pretty much as directly opposed to my own as anybody I've ever encountered. Everything in the Philippians study that we did was essentially like the opposite of what he is appealing to here. And another thing, you know, the world, he says, is the will to power and nothing besides. And you yourselves are also this will to power and nothing besides. So for Nietzsche, everything boils down to power. And he did not view this as negative. He's like, that's just the way things are. And he wants to embrace that reality because it is reality as he sees it, and say yes to life, which involves all these things. So there's some pretty shocking things in his writings, which I can't get into now, but I was shocked when I read his stuff. So the will to power is a major contribution that Nietzsche makes, and it's everywhere in postmodern thought. They use it in very different ways. Okay, as far as like what we should do, Nietzsche is like, yeah, you know, will to power means exploiting people now and then. Like, it's just, that's what you got to do. Postmodern thinkers are the opposite. They want to preserve. They want to like lift up the marginalized and oppressed. At least that's what they claim to be after in their thought. But they assume his view that power is what's under everything, and that's the paradigm that they're operating out of, even though they really disagree with what we should do as a consequence of that. So the second thing that he does that really, another major contribution that informs the hermeneutics of suspicion is this genre of genealogy, where he essentially tries to undermine, subvert something. And specifically what he was trying to subvert in his book, The Genealogy of Morality, was the kind of Christian moral culture of Europe. He saw that as a denial of life. And so he tries to explain how it emerged. He presents this theory of how that morality emerged as a way to undermine it. Okay, and that's this genre of genealogy. So what he suggests is that he kind of posits these two classes, nobles and slaves, more or less. And these two classes are different. They have different approaches to conquering and ruling. The knightly aristocracy, who are kind of his heroes, they set up hierarchies through forceful mastery. Whereas the priestly aristocracy set up hierarchies through moral purity, because they can't overpower the nobles, the knights. They have to set up this new system that they can actually succeed in, which is like a kind of moral purity. So he says the knightly nobles are characterized by what Nietzsche sees as a yes to life, right? It's these values of powerful physicality, a blossoming, rich, even effervescent good health that includes the things needed to maintain it: war, adventure, hunting, dancing, jousting, and everything else that contains strong, free, happy action. That's how he describes the noble values. Okay, slaves can't overcome the knights. They're way stronger. If they go to war with the knights, they'll be destroyed. So they have to subvert it. And the way that they subvert it, according to Nietzsche, is by displacing that whole value system with another value system in which the priest, the weak, can gain the upper hand. So they're going to replace strength, courage, pride, that kind of stuff with the priestly values of love, humility, and forgiveness, right? So under that new system, they can gain the upper hand because it doesn't have to do with strength where they're outmatched. And so this is what he says about like the priestly approach to things. He says, as we know, priests make the most evil enemies. But why? Because they are the most powerless. Out of this powerlessness, their hate swells into something huge. Nothing that has been done on earth against the noble, the mighty, the masters, and the rulers is worth mentioning compared to what? Wait for it. The Jews have done against them. The Jews, that priestly people, which in the last resort was able to gain satisfaction from its enemies and conquerors only through a radical reevaluation of their values. Good dose of anti-Semitism. I'm amazed at how many people try and defend him against anti-Semitism. But he looks at the entire sort of, from the prophets on through the New Testament, that entire system of like lifting up the oppressed. He doesn't like that. And so he sees that as just this will to power at work, trying to gain the upper hand over like the oppressors that had successively conquered them with this new value system. He says it was the Jews who, rejecting the aristocratic value equation, good equals noble, equals powerful, equals beautiful, equals happy, equals blessed. He said the Jews ventured with awe-inspiring consistency to bring about a reversal and held it in the teeth of the most unfathomable hatred. Only those who suffer are good. Only the poor, the powerless, the lowly are good. The suffering, the deprived, the sick, the ugly are the only pious people, the only ones saved. Salvation is for them alone. So you can see just Nietzsche really does not like that value system that sort of elevates anything that can be perceived as weakness. And so he calls this the slave revolt in morality. Okay, the whole system of Christian morals was a sneaky plot by the Jews to subvert their Roman conquerors with a new system of values. Okay, this is how he explains the emergence of the Christian sort of moral system that was prevalent in Europe that he hated. Like this genealogy at work. This is really popular as a genre. I'm showing you what it is so that you can kind of see what people are drawing on when they use this genre. So just as Marx saw nothing but sort of bourgeois interest behind the systems of law and morality, Nietzsche sees nothing but slave or priestly or Jewish interest behind the Judeo-Christian system of morals. It was nothing but an act of self-assertion or revenge, okay, on the stronger class. So I'm just gonna, for the sake of giving you a little bit more appreciation of Nietzsche, he says, from the trunk of the tree of revenge and hatred, Jewish hatred, the deepest and most sublime, indeed a hatred which created ideals and changed values. He says there grew something just as incomparable, a new love, the deepest and most sublime kind of love. But don't make the mistake of thinking that it had grown forth as a denial of their thirst for revenge, as the opposite of Jewish hatred. No, the reverse is true. This love grew out of hatred as its crown. And then he goes on, this Jesus of Nazareth, as the embodiment of the gospel of love, this Redeemer bringing salvation and victory to the poor, to the sick, to sinners, was he not seduction in its most sinister and irresistible form? Seduction and the circuitous route to just those very Jewish values and innovative ideals. Did Israel not reach the pinnacle of her sublime vengefulness in this very Redeemer? That's how he views Jesus. He says, that Israel had to denounce her actual instrument of, he says, where's he put it? He's talking about this is a grand politics of revenge. Jesus himself in the crucifixion is as a far-sighted subterranean revenge, slow to grip and calculating, that Israel had to denounce her actual instrument of revenge before all the world as a mortal enemy and nail him to the cross so that all the world, namely Israel's enemies, could safely nibble at this bait. Jesus is just this elaborate, like far-seeing scheme to replace Roman values with Jewish values.
Which sounds like a brilliant will to power.
Well, exactly. That's why they're the most dangerous. So he's something, huh? So behind all truth claims, morality systems, is nothing but these deceptively veiled interests. Okay, so there's suspicion is, yeah, behold the birth of the hermeneutics of suspicion. All right, Freud is the third of the three masters. So I don't have time to get into his stuff as much, but so basically Freud's contribution is this idea of self-deception. Everybody is self-deceived. Again, so when we're talking about consciousness, for Freud, that's very untrustworthy because he kind of splits our psyche into the id, which is our like primal base impulses like sexual stuff, aggression, those things that are all subconscious. Then there's the ego, which is mediating between the id and the superego, which is like morality systems and stuff like that. So it's in this kind of dynamic between those three things that like we actually live, but there's a lot of self-deception that goes on to try and navigate those competing voices, those competing impulses. So because self-deception is so central to his paradigm, when he has like patients or whatever that make false statements, he doesn't even look at it as them actively trying to deceive the psychoanalyst. For him, it's like they're just speaking out of their own self-deception. They're so deceived about how they actually feel that what they say is not true, not in a conscious way, but just speaking out of that self-deception. So as a consequence of that, one thing that I want to highlight, because I do think it becomes relevant, and because of how suspicious it is in its nature, one of his, this is all from a book by a guy called Andrew Dole, who wrote, he wrote a book called Reframing the Masters of Suspicion. And so he says that Freud's standard response to criticism of his theories of psychoanalysis was to turn psychoanalysis against his critics. So when a critic will challenge his psychoanalytic theory, he'll just turn it back on them. He'll apply it to them as a way to kind of defend himself. And so Dole calls this a recursive ad hominem defense. It's recursive because rather than like giving new evidence for pointing out internal flaws in what his critics might be saying, he simply reapplies the very claims that are under attack to them. So he says in this book, The History of the Psychoanalytic Movement, he says, if it was true that the associated connections I have discovered were kept from the knowledge of patients by inward resistances of an affective or emotional kind, he says, then these resistances would be found to appear in the healthy also. As soon as, from some external source, they became confronted with what was repressed. It was not surprising that they should be able to justify on intellectual grounds this rejection of my ideas, though it was actually effective in nature. So it's kind of like begging the question, which I had intended to talk about one time, but couldn't get to. He's just assuming his theory in face of the criticisms rather than engaging with the criticisms themselves. So Dole illustrates this with this. Carl Jung was another kind of famous psychoanalyst, and they had a relationship which eventually kind of deteriorated. And so part of that is because of this very practice. And so Dole gives these excerpts from their letters to one another. So in a letter to Freud on their deteriorating friendship, Jung says, I can only assure you that there is no resistance on my side unless it be resistance to being treated like a fool riddled with complexes. I think I have objective reasons for my views. He's like, give me a break, man. In another letter, he said, a particularly preposterous bit of nonsense now going around is that my libido theory is the product of anal eroticism. When I consider who cooked up this theory, I fear for the future of analysis. So Freud responds to Jung by saying, it is convention among us analysts that none of us feel ashamed of his own bit of neuroses. But one who, while behaving abnormally, keeps shouting that he is normal, gives ground for the suspicion that he lacks insight into his illness, okay? So there's the recursive ad hominem defense at work. Accordingly, I propose that we abandon our personal relations entirely. I shall lose nothing by it, for my only emotional tie with you has been long on a thin thread, the lingering effect of past disappointments. He's a nice guy. So, so Freud's suspicious approach eliminates the need to seriously consider what Jung might have, like any legitimate concerns that Jung might have had, any legitimate responses, because it was just all part of the theory. So if Jung claims that he had objective reasons to reject Freud's suggestion that his theories were just a product of his anal erotic desires, the response, well, that's exactly what I would expect someone with anal erotic desires to say, is not appropriate. It doesn't help, right? And so that suspicion applied that way is bound to only produce hostility. I bet that's the only time that anal erotic desire has ever been discussed in JCC Sunday School. You guys can be glad that I didn't get into Freud's other thought, which is.
Thank you.
Okay, so anyway, the joint influence of these guys is what matters. You put their thought together, these different contributions that they made, and you can see it very prevalent in the way that postmodernism kind of emerges. Marx frames everything in terms of antagonism between classes. Nietzsche makes everything about power. Freud makes self-deception the kind of default assumption. And so those insights kind of like come together and have a really powerful influence on the thought that comes after them. Essentially what happens is people like Ricoeur and Foucault, who we'll be talking about Foucault here, take that stuff and then they just like, they kind of apply it in new ways, but they're working with the same assumptions, okay? So we talked about Derrida before. Foucault is the one who, Derrida we talked about with kind of in the context of the postmodern knowledge principle. He was working with language. He had power concerns as well, but Foucault is the one who really focuses on the power principle, on the power elements of these masters of suspicion. So Foucault took the hermeneutics of suspicion. He combines it with Derrida's postmodern perspective on language, and then he applies those things to like social and political things that are going on around. So it's unlike Ricoeur, who's more unlike Derrida, who's more in the literary sphere, it's more kind of academic. Foucault is taking this and he's making it very much more applicable to real life, to society and what's going on in it. So Foucault says in any given culture, in any given moment, there is always only one episteme, okay? An episteme is a dominant set of ideas. It's a dominant framework for looking at the world. I mean, he says there's only one episteme that defines the conditions of and possibility of all knowledge. So building on people also like Thomas Kuhn, who we've talked about, there's basically one dominant way of looking at the world, and that's sort of established through social power, and it controls the way that we are able to think about things. Okay, so stuff like knowledge, again, knowledge, truth claims, that's all in the realm of like stuff that we can say about the world. What he's saying is that these power structures control our ability to think about things in a certain way. And so it really all comes down to whoever happens to be the sort of dominant force in society. So that perspective on how we are able to make sense of the world is, and this is drawing heavily on the language stuff, it's established through discourses. We come up with these ways of talking about stuff, and those ways of talking about stuff perpetuate the perspective of the dominant sort of social power at the time. So Foucault writes that power is everywhere, not because it's embraced everything, but because it comes from everywhere. And that he's talking about discourses there. It leads people to learn to speak the discourses, and having learned to speak those discourses, that then just reinforces the sort of powerful assumptions. So as a consequence of this, okay, so you got unjust power everywhere. And as a consequence of this, speech is to be closely scrutinized to discover which discourses it is perpetuating. Okay, under the presumption that racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, or other latent prejudices must be present in the discourses and thus endemic to the society that produces them. So this is where he starts to get very close to Derrida, and where he's assuming that these oppressive power interests are at play under the very language systems that we use. And so those kind of language systems have to be perpetually challenged and scrutinized. And you kind of have to you have to really closely evaluate them to find where these sort of unjust power interests are at play in the discourses that we use. So there are some real consequences to these kind of, hopefully it's clear how like all of this stuff very much is operative at the worldview level, okay? It's not like, to some degree, you can make arguments about this stuff, but when Nietzsche says about the will to power, these just the grounding assumptions that you've got these conflicting power interests that play everywhere, and that they get in the way of our access to truth, right? The concept that we're just constantly self-deceived. These are worldview statements. These aren't like empirically built kinds of statements. So I do think we have to kind of engage them at the worldview level. And one of the ways that I want to do that is just by asking the question of, what if reality really is the way that Foucault says it is, right? What if these three masters are correct about, suspicion being the necessary default posture towards everything, towards anything anybody says. I think there are some really significant implications of that, and it's worth kind of sitting with that question and looking around at our society and asking whether those things are at play. So Thistleton's book that I mentioned before here, Interpreting God in the Postmodern Self, is really helpful on this question. He's very insightful in his exploration of what's going on here. So he says the postmodern self perceives itself as having lost control as an active agent, and as having been transformed into a passive victim of competing groups. Everyone seems to be at the mercy of someone else's vested interest for power. He continues, in matters of race, class, gender, and professional guilds, the gloves are off. For what counts as true for one group is often disparaged as a manipulative disguise to legitimate power claims by another group. If different groups choose to adopt different criteria of truth to determine what counts as true, or even what counts as a meaningful truth claim, rational argument and dialogue become undermined by recurring appeals to what one group counts as axioms, but seem far from axiomatic to the other. So at this point, argument becomes transposed into rhetoric. And rhetoric then comes to rely on force, seduction, or manipulation. So I think it's a valid insight that if our fundamental stance is one of suspicion, right? If we can't take anybody's word at face value, then it really does, then why dialogue? Why have conversations? All the person is going to be speaking out of is their veiled power interests, right? So it takes away that incentive to give somebody the benefit of the doubt, to be open, like Gadamer talked about in our dialogue with one another, right? So, so if you think about it, right, those worldviews have a lot of parallels to like conspiracy theories, right? They're not conspiracy theories because conspiracy theories require a kind of like intentional collaboration between people, between entities, but nonetheless there's a lot of similarities that are worth exploring, because I think in addition to the hermeneutics of suspicion being extremely prevalent right now, so are conspiracy theories. They're rampant, and there's a lot of reasons for that, but in my view, there's a lot of parallels between those two ways of looking at the world, and that's what Andrew Dole was exploring in his book. So. What he does is he makes the distinction between the two, between like the thought of the masters of suspicion and conspiracy theories. Nonetheless, he creates a kind of larger category that he refers to as suspicious explanation, the suspicious explanation of large-scale phenomena. And there's suspicious explanation is suspicious because it posits, because of the characteristics of hiddenness and badness in its explanations. In other words, suspicious explanations postulate hidden bad causes. And on that level, that's one thing that conspiracy theories and the hermeneutics of suspicion share in common. And so he says that the works of the masters share some of the characteristics of conspiracy theories that have been grounds for reservations regarding the intellectual legitimacy of the latter. So there are things that are very appealing about conspiracy theories. There's a reason they take hold. And I think the same is true with the hermeneutics of suspicion. But the explanations that they provide, there's more needed for an explanation to be good than just for it to have an appeal, right? You need for an explanation to be good, it needs to be plausible, in addition to just being able to explain stuff well if it does happen to be true. And so by virtue of the fact that suspicious explanation posits hidden stuff, in other words, it's not obvious on the surface, because it has to posit something hidden, for Dole, that's a strike against the plausibility of suspicious explanation. That it doesn't necessarily mean that it's not true. It might still be true, but by virtue of requiring something hidden to make the explanation, it makes its plausibility kind of an uphill battle. Yeah.
I wonder if a better word for that would be probable as opposed to plausible. Because I think when we get into a lot of, where this whole hermeneutic of suspicion works, is they kind of see, to me anyways, they run on the word, because it's plausible, therefore it is, or like, because there's a chance you don't know what you're talking about, therefore you don't know what you're talking about, because there's a chance, versus is it probable?
I think what you mean there is what he does mean by plausible.
Oh, okay.
I think you're basically, I think you have the same kind of.
Okay.
Yeah. So he says, for something to be hidden in general, for its existence not to be evident to causal or even close observation, makes it less plausible than it would other be, right? If it was just like obvious that this thing is an explanation, then you can appeal to stuff like rational argument. But when it's this hidden stuff, whether it's self-deception or interest, then you get much more kind of speculative in your explanations. So there's a couple of reasons that he talks about that make these kinds of explanations compelling. He talks about ethical leveraging. Basically, a suspicious explanation gives, it offers a measure of control over the thing being explained, right? If you can explain that there's this bad thing happening, these are the causes, then it might give you some measure of control over the bad thing. So if you share the suspicious explanation's value system, that like this thing is bad and I want it to change, then that kind of suspicious explanation, like it gives you motivation to go with the thing, because it's like you hope to be able to control it. So Marx sees these really bad kind of economic disparities. He provides this explanation in hopes that the explanation can give us some recourse to like fixing what he sees as problems, right? So and you can see that with, I mean, lots of anything explaining something, the causes of something bad, gives you kind of like hope that you can make some changes. So there's that ethical leveraging that make these kinds of explanations appealing. Something else called pragmatic weighting. Basically, typically suspicious explanation posits something that's like a really big deal. So the consequences of not believing it if it's true are a lot more serious than the consequences of believing it if it's not true. So you kind of do like a cost benefit analysis, and even if you have reservations, it's like, well, you know, if I'm wrong, if they're right, then this is huge. And so you might follow it at least down some roads, and that can make it appealing. The biggest thing though is what he calls epistemic siloing. And that's what I want to focus on, because I think that both with the hermeneutics of suspicion, operative in postmodernism, and with conspiracy theories, epistemic siloing is the big thing. So what that is it's like what we talked about with recursive ad hominem defense, right? When a suspicious explanation by its nature affects the capacity of those who believe it to critically engage with certain information. So if the so like the recursive ad hominem thing, right? If you're applying psychoanalysis to your critics, of course they're self-deceived. Of course they're going to be resistant to what I'm suggesting. then it reduces your ability to engage with their claims in a serious way. And so it starts to create this silo where there's certain information, there's certain testimony that you don't have access to because your explanation itself almost like rules it out a priori. Dole says reasoned discourse concerning psychoanalysis is only possible among those who accept it, right? Others are, to paraphrase Freud, are to be regarded as more patients than peers. So, like, as an example, if I believe that there is a fight club that meets in the basement of JCC, whose one rule is don't talk about Fight Club, then it will affect my ability to critically evaluate Paul's claim that no, I'm not a member of a fight club that meets in the basement of JCC, right? Yeah, you would say that, Paul. So by cutting off my access to that disconfirming information, it increases the staying power of that suspicious explanation, because things that might call it in question just get ruled out kind of before really being engaged. He says another thing that makes epistemic siloing prevalent is its connection to our human tendency to create different groups, to make in-groups and out-groups. We just are very good at dividing humanity into different groups. And like there's our in-group and then there's all of them, right? And in addition to that, like dividing us into groups, what we do is we attribute bad characteristics to the out-groups. When you do that, it makes suspicious explanation all that much more like plausible, because you're already assuming bad things about the outgroups. And so if your suspicious explanation depends on those outgroups being bad, then you get into this cycle, into this silo. Because like if one of them is going to come to you and contest something that you're suggesting, right, then you're going to say, well, that's what I would expect somebody from that outgroup to say, right? And this is just so broadly applicable that I'm trying to keep it really general because it happens all over the place. Kind of lost my place here. Okay, I think you guys probably get the picture there, right? So, oh yes.
I'm slow
Okay.
in trying to process all of this.
It's not you, it's me.
No. We started out with Marx and Nietzsche and I mean, as I understand it, basically, they came to the conclusion that because there's selfishness and therefore power inequities that result from selfishness, selfishness is everything. And anything else beyond selfishness, like morality, is really a play at selfishness. It's really, we're all selfish. And if that's true, then we have to be suspicious of everybody other than ourselves, because everybody else is selfish.
And even ourselves, to be
And
fair.
even ourselves, and we can't even diagnose ourselves in our selfishness. And so it's this preoccupation with selfishness, and then you see it in more recent times with Richard Dawkins and the selfish gene, and it's all built into us, and it is what it is, and it then gets into, and I'll be anxious to see how you get out of this, how postmodernism can be so seemingly altruistic based on all of this selfishness. But anyway, sorry.
That's the real question. That's the real question, because in my view, and this is really kind of simplistic and reductionistic way to express it, but it does seem like they've accepted the breed of morality that Nietzsche despised and Nietzsche's paradigm, and they're trying to work with both, and it seems to me that both are incompatible. So if you accept what Nietzsche says about reality, what you're talking about, that it's all about power interest, then what's the source of this desire to help the oppressed? Like where does that come from? They don't seem to me to provide any explanation for that. It's got to come from somewhere. And it seems to me like they're standing on the shoulders of giants when they appeal to those aims, right? that comes from somewhere. It was not self-evident, right? Nietzsche was correct that what the cross introduced was radical at the time. Humility was not a virtue in the ancient world. Like, there's a reason humility is a virtue now. And Nietzsche is correct that it's Christianity. And so it seems to me that, I think that I don't think that the postmodern world has been able to come to terms with some of those dissonances. My paradigm for approaching hermeneutics has been the paradigm of relationship. Okay, the course is called Reading for Relationship because it seems to me that communication and interpretation are the fundamental grounds through which relationship is available to us. So what I think it makes sense to explore is the consequences of applying hermeneutics of suspicion as a controlling paradigm to relationship. What does it do to that? I think that one good tell that somebody's working from a suspicious paradigm is if what they're claiming can be reduced to a kind of just statement. So you're just saying that because you're a liberal, you're white, you're black, you're a woman, you're a cop, you're part of the media, you're a capitalist because of your anal erotic desires. Like any just is, I think, a pretty good indication that somebody's working with a reductive kind of hermeneutic of suspicion.
Just because you're not me or my group.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So due to this kind of like the siloing nature that we've been talking about, suspicious explanation of all forms takes hold in a way that becomes very difficult to challenge or to reevaluate, right? If everyone's motives are suspect, and no one's word can be taken at face value or given the benefit of the doubt, then the only real option left to us is to just trust the people who are in our in-group, right? I can't trust anybody out there. I gotta just choose who I'm gonna trust. And what happens is I choose my in-group, and guess what? You get these massive echo chambers. You get these massive epistemic silos, and people, and then the stuff that's said inside those can get more and more extreme, and nobody figures it out because there's nothing to challenge it, right? And it seems to me like that is exactly what's happening to our society right now. That suspicious explanation gets us into these echo chambers, and we get further and further and further apart. And furthermore, what then begins to happen is we start to make the worst possible interpretations of someone else's motive, who's in an out group, right? Someone else's motive, the worst possible interpretations of what they meant, of what they did. It's like it's way beyond not giving them the benefit of the doubt. It's actually like positing the worst possible explanation for why they would have done that thing, right? It's extremely destructive. It's again so far from Gadamer's hermeneutics that I had been kind of advocating for a few sessions back. So what space in that paradigm is left for relationship, right? Where does it leave us if our will to power has compromised any hope for meaningful communication? What hope is there for reconciliation between alienated people groups when you're operating from a hermeneutic of suspicion? It seems to me that when people are operating out of that, claiming to be pursuing reconciliation, I don't see how you get there. So we were indeed interrupted by a fire drill, and I'm going to pick up hopefully right where we left off. And the question I'm asking, okay, is where does the hermeneutics of suspicion lead us, especially as far as relationship is concerned? So in session 6, I mentioned the psychologist John Gottman and his Love Lab, where he analyzes thousands of couples. He'd run thousands of couples through there, evaluated the way that relationships operate and the kinds of things that cause relationships to break down. And there's something really interesting and I think applicable that he says. He says people are in one of two states in a relationship. The first is what I call positive sentiment override, where positive emotion overrides irritability. It's like a buffer. The spouse will do something bad and they'll say, oh, he's just in a crummy mood. Or they can be a negative sentiment override. In the negative sentiment override, sorry, I lost my spot here. even a relatively neutral thing that a partner says gets perceived as negative. In the negative sentiment override, people draw lasting conclusions about each other. If their spouse does something positive, it's a selfish person doing a positive thing, okay? It's really hard to change those states, and those states determine whether, when one party tries to repair things, the other party sees that as repair or hostile manipulation. So Gottman says that once a couple starts the descent down towards negative emotion, 94% will continue to go down. They start on a bad course, he says, and they can't correct it. So I think it's a good illustration on the effect that the hermeneutics of suspicion have if we consider all the various assumptions that they bring with them for motives and what's driving other people, right? What I think it makes sense to ask is, think of your closest relationships, right? A spouse, a roommate, best friends, parents, siblings. What would the impact on that relationship be if they assume that everything that you said was merely an expression of your own power interests, right? And that nothing that you said could be taken at face value, but that, you know, it had to have its attempt at self-assertion unmasked. What if they assume the worst possible motives behind any claims that you made? My question is, could that relationship last, right? 94% is hardly a figure to scoff at. So Thistleton says some really profound and I think also disturbing things as he's reflecting on the potential effect of this postmodern kind of worldview on human interactions, on human assumptions, on the implications for society. And essentially he says that in the modern worldview, essentially if you encounter misfortune of some kind, right, some loss of privilege, then you can look at it as like bad luck. You can have the attitude of, well, I'm just gonna, do what I can to get myself out of these situations, okay? But the postmodern self assumes that I am a victim of some power interest. So Thistleton says, but if the modern self is content to say, that's life, the postmodern self assumes the discourse of accusation and conflict. It's them, right? For the loss of power, loss of privilege, or loss of well-being is now ascribed to the manipulative power interests of competing persons or competing groups. He continues, misfortune seems neither random nor unavoidable, but a byproduct of the success of some other group. This group may take the form of some professional guild, especially lawyers, doctors, clergy, or managers, or of some different social class, gender, or ethnic profile. At all events, blame, accusation, and hostility come to absorb the concerns of the postmodern self. A breakdown of trust in virtually all governments, whether democratically elected or not, has become a hallmark of the mid-1990s. Thistleton was writing this in 1995. And I would say that everything that he said certainly goes for the 2020s. So again, if we hold to these suspicious assumptions about the nature of truth, of power interests, and discourse, then he says little or no room has now been left for negotiation through rational dialogue and argument. Where truth has largely become absorbed into structures and spheres of power, argument and reason collapse into a rhetoric of force, using persuasion or pressure. He continues that the devaluation of the currency of rational dialogue into rhetoric, I suggest, brings about one of the most socially sinister and destructive consequences of the postmodern self. For let us return to my earlier point about the contrast between a courageous accepting that's life and the accusatory it's them. How can the human self respond to the power interests of them? As Alistair McIntyre, among others, reminds us, as long as there remains sufficient consensus concerning what counts as reasoned, rational, or moral, reasoned debate in the public domain remains an effective arbiter within the frame of common tradition. But if each competing group, class, ethnic tradition, gender, guild, or party produces its own internal criteria of supposed rationality in order to serve its own power interests, rational debate collapses not only into mere rhetoric, but soon also into accusation, blame, corporate self-righteousness, and conflict. Okay, there's a suspicion of other groups and their interests, and the despair regarding the possibility, the capacity for meaningful communication because of what we hold about how people are making decisions and how self-deceived they are and how it's all about interest, right? The suspicion of other groups and their interests and the despair regarding meaningful communication creates a situation where a cycle of escalating exertions of force between groups is increasingly possible, right? You can get into a cycle where all that's left to us is force or violence, and you can see how that could easily escalate, right? He says, inevitably, the pressure of rhetoric escalates into the pressure of violence. So this, I think, is where suspicion leads us. There's a significant difference, in my view, between the worldview where all is power and the worldview where the ground of all being is personal and triune, such that the statement, God is love, is meaningful, and where God, come in the flesh, can be called both the Word and the truth. So I think there are significant dangers and threats to the hermeneutics of suspicion, in particular as they are adopted as a kind of totalizing worldview, as a kind of overarching paradigm through which we look at the world. I do not see how we can get to a place of peace, how we can achieve reconciliation, how there can be any harmony between competing groups or competing ideas if the hermeneutics of suspicion is what is adopted. I really do think that it poses a major societal threat should that paradigm become dominant and held by lots of groups in our society. And it does seem to me, it's something that is very concerning, that has begun to happen across the ideological spectrum. Okay, so I think I've probably been pretty clear. I have some real criticisms of the hermeneutics of suspicion. I think it leads us to some very dangerous places, and frankly, I don't see how you can get out of them if that's your controlling paradigm, okay? But, there's a major, I think, caveat that we really do have to account for, and I'm sure for anyone who might be, have some sympathies with what the masters of suspicion are saying, there are probably some glaring questions that have been in the back of your minds. What about the times when suspicion is warranted, right? What about the stuff that the masters of suspicion happen to be right about? Yes, as a totalizing paradigm, I think it is very destructive. But there are some, coming from a Christian worldview, I think there are some insights that the Bible brings to the table that actually would consider what the masters of suspicion have to say in a favorable light, at least recognizing that there's some legitimacy to them. So the Bible is quite open to the notion that we can be self-deceived, right? In Jeremiah 17:9, it says the heart is deceitful above all things and beyond cure. Who can understand it, right? In our church service today after Sunday school, Pastor Dave was talking about the fruit of the Spirit and how it is something that is in conflict with what Paul calls the flesh. And the flesh is something that can be very enslaving. And that came through in the passage in Galatians 5 that we were reading. So the Bible does have something to say about sin, and sin does align with a lot of the things that the masters of suspicion were pointing out, right? Whether we're talking about how our power interests can cause us to act out against others, to exploit others. It's a very common biblical theme. A measure of self-deception that occurs, a measure of enslavement to our kind of like fleshly desires, as Paul might call them. So, on one hand, Paul Ricoeur rejects the hermeneutics of suspicion as a kind of controlling or totalizing paradigm. He would prefer a hermeneutic of faith. At the same time, he recognizes that Freud, Marx, Nietzsche do offer us some tools, okay, for evaluating self-deception, hypocrisy, false consciousness, to the extent that those things are present in us, right? So I want to point to a distinction. We're going to be talking about Ricoeur and what Anthony Thistleton refers to as the hermeneutics of suspicion and retrieval. And I want to point to a distinction between the way that I see the term hermeneutics of suspicion used quite broadly and the way that Paul Ricoeur actually uses the term in his own writing, in his own thought. It seems to me that when he utilizes the term in the hermeneutics of suspicion, he's doing so to encourage me not to direct it outward at the them, right, but to direct it rather inward towards my own heart, to use it as a check against my sinful impulses, against my idols. Such a checking device is necessary, says Thistleton, in our hermeneutics, since all human judgments about interpretation remain fallible. Okay, so again, the primary emphasis here is on using suspicion to unmask our own idols so that we can listen well again. Since sin is present everywhere, right, including the contemporary writers that we're seeking to interpret, there will be times when suspicion can appropriately be turned outwards. But I think the healthiest use of it involves using it first on ourselves before we apply it to others, to address the log in our own eye, so to speak, before addressing the speck in our neighbors. And I think that's what Alexander Solzhenitsyn was getting at in his famous line in the Gulag Archipelago, where he says, gradually it was disclosed to me that the line separating good and evil passes not through states, nor between classes, nor between political parties either, but right through every human heart, through all human hearts. And so, and he continued to say that I have come to understand the truth of all religions in the world to be that they struggle with the evil inside a human being. And I think there's something to that. Recognizing that the first evil that we need to address is the evil in our own hearts, I think, is very much the right way to approach evil. And it protects us from the kind of escalation that we've been talking about. So to this end, okay, I would suggest that in particular, special care must be taken in applying suspicion to what we would consider an outgroup. Okay, suspicion, there is a time and a place for it. There is a time and a place for a strong critical appraisal of something, to ask hard questions about motives, about interest, about self-deception, and all of those things. I do think there's a valid place for those elements as tools. That said, the human tendency is generally to posit the best possible appraisal of the motives of those in our in-group and the worst possible appraisal of the motives of those in out-groups. And that kind of double standard will lead to all the problems with the hermeneutics of suspicion that we've been addressing, right? So Christians should be consistent here in how we apply these things. If we're going to use suspicion, fine, but it should be applied to everyone in an equal measure, right? And if we're going to hope for the best, fine, but it should be applied to everyone in an equal measure. It seems to me that both of these do have warrant, they do have a place, but they have to be approached appropriately, correctly. What is critical, right, is finding how to use suspicion without allowing it to become a totalizing worldview or even dominant. So Thistleton says that it's one task of theology, among others, to attempt to disentangle manipulative power bids from non-manipulative truth claims, and to distinguish evidence, argument, or valid testimony from modes of rhetoric which rely on seduction, disguised force, or illegitimate appeals to privilege. Okay, so I think that's where Ricoeur is particularly helpful. He recognizes that suspicion has a use, that the things that the masters of suspicion introduced have a kind of place at the table, but he's trying to have a much more holistic view of interpretation, so that he advocates for a hermeneutics of suspicion with the purpose of making a hermeneutics of retrieval possible. He wants to make us able to listen again. And so that's why suspicion is applied primarily to ourselves. So there's this really famous quote that he has that Thistleton cites a lot. Basically, and Thistleton says it's the heart of hermeneutical theory. He says the heart of hermeneutical theory finds its clearest expression in this quote from Ricoeur. Ricoeur says, hermeneutics seems to me to be animated by this double motivation: willingness to suspect, willingness to listen. Vow of rigor, vow of obedience. He says, in our time, we have not finished doing away with idols, and we have barely begun to listen to symbols. So I do think that hopefully my approach to introducing these topics, this hermeneutics of suspicion, shows how critical I am of it as a totalizing worldview, as a kind of dominant enterprise for how we approach interpretation. But what I don't want to do is completely remove suspicion from the table, because primarily of human sin, and the Bible recognizes that human sin is a big deal, and it's a significant factor in human life. Because of the prevalence of sin, there are times where suspicion is warranted, but it has to be approached very carefully, and it should always be applied to myself first. So I want to close with some responses and conclusions. First thing I want to say, which I've kind of just mentioned, but is the problem with suspicion as a totalizing worldview. Okay, so I've already mentioned how so much of what we're after in this course is the avoidance of extremes. And hopefully the discussion of the dangers of suspicion, along with the discussion of their potential appropriate use, has made a decent argument for finding some balance there, right? Avoiding extremes on either side. I do think that suspicion as a totalizing worldview destroys the capacity for relationship. It destroys the capacity for reconciliation, and it destroys the capacity for learning from groups that are significantly different than our own. If we are going to apply suspicion outwards, it's best to do so with a kind of question, right? Is it possible that such and such a motive underlies that claim? Rather than just the totalizing assumption that, like, clearly this motive underlies that claim. But we don't want to stay in the place of suspicion, right? Ricoeur refers to that as a kind of desert, the desert of criticism. And he says, beyond the desert of criticism, we wish to be called again. Okay? There's a place for asking hard questions about motives or what have you. But the point of doing that is so that we can get to meaningful communication. Hopefully we can clear away idols in our own hearts and potentially in the hearts of others, so that we can then come to a place where we're in dialogue once again, and we can meaningfully communicate so that we can be in meaningful relationship. That's the goal. So certainly, as a totalizing worldview, which is essentially what happens with the masters of suspicion, I would say the postmodern thinkers who come after them, is they take valid insights and they blow them up into a worldview that leads to some really destructive places. Okay, so there's the problem of utilizing suspicion as that kind of totalizing worldview. There's another problem with the hermeneutics of suspicion that was brought up in our time together earlier, which just has to do with its inherent hypocrisy, or I guess lack of self-awareness. And so Alison Scott Bauman, who wrote on Ricoeur and the hermeneutics of suspicion, she says that Marx, Freud, and Nietzsche needed a dose of their own hermeneutics of suspicion. And she has that Ricoeur concluded that, as well as drawing our attention to vital problems, the masters of suspicion were themselves concealing ideologies and powerful beliefs beneath their suspicion of religion and their views of human nature. So this is something that also came up, I think, last session. But Ben Meyer has an article where he suggests that none of the masters of suspicion was eager to apply his explanation to his own work. Right? He said maybe we could wring it out of Freud that there was something underneath there. But Marx knew, as we know, that he did not write Das Kapital out of material interest. Nor does The Will to Power explain the composition of Nietzsche's numerous monographs on the will to power, right? So Meyer's the one who kind of turns the tables on the masters of suspicion. He says, the followers of Nietzsche and Foucault are passionately persuaded that truth is a mere rhetorical device employed in the service of oppression, and say so at length. What then is the status of their saying so? We should give them their choice. Is it false, or is it in the service of oppression? Right? So that's kind of cheeky, but you do get the point. And frankly, I don't think I have yet to see a great answer to that challenge being offered to the hermeneutics of suspicion as it's practiced, as it's advocated by those figures. So the hermeneutics of suspicion can also have a stultifying effect, and this is pretty closely related to the siloing that I was talking about. Basically, when our suspicion makes it impossible to hear what another person might legitimately be saying, it stultifies any capacity for relationship, for legitimate communication, and all of the life-giving stuff that can come from those things. Okay, so the final thing to talk about is some biblical themes that point beyond suspicion. And I want to be very clear that, again, the Bible pulls no punches about the nature of sin. And there are certainly correspondences between the things that the masters of suspicion identified and sin as a biblical theme, okay? But in a Christian worldview, okay, and I've been making this point kind of consistently through the course, all is not power. At the source of all reality in the Christian worldview, we find the triune God whose very being, by its interpersonal nature, is love. God is love. And human beings are created in the image of God, right? For this reason, while we expect to find sin in the motives of others, because we do live in a fallen world, we also expect that there may be love there as well. Okay? In some Christian theological traditions, this is referred to as common grace. And this provides a powerful impetus towards Ricoeur's willingness to listen, right? Towards Gadamer's approach to hermeneutics. A hermeneutic of faith and hope, trust that meaningful communication is possible, and it hopes that loving relationship may be the end result of that kind of communication. And indeed, that is perhaps where the hermeneutic of love is most powerfully seen, right? In the loving willingness to listen respectfully, even to our enemies, even if it may cost us. The cross, I would suggest, and I mentioned this earlier today, is the paradigmatic alternative to the Nietzschean will to power, okay? There we see Jesus in the place of highest power, not exploit that power to his own advantage, but rather empty himself in self-giving, others-centered love. Jesus shows us that there is another way, okay? And contrary to Nietzsche's suspicious contention, right, that this love was not a veil for revenge through transvaluation, okay? It was rather an unveiling of what is most true about reality. What we see in Jesus is what is most true about the world. What we see there is not power, or rather, what we see there is that power exists in the service of a deeper reality of self-giving, others-centered love, okay, that's grounded in the Trinity. Our belief that we can entrust ourselves to the love of God enables us to lay down our interests for the sake of others. It enables us to listen with openness, refusing to embrace the worst interpretations of people's motives, despite, okay, a critically informed understanding of the risks posed by our mutual sinfulness. It's at the foot of the cross that we find our interest and will to power, both recognized and forgiven, so that we can then offer the same gracious forgiveness to others when power interests rear their ugly heads and our genuine, open, trusting stance is repaid with evil or abuse. This capacity to trust and forgive in love and hope is what breaks the cycles of manipulation and violence that suspicion brings about. Interest is a legitimate obstacle to genuine relationship, but suspicion is not the way over that obstacle. Faith, hope, and love are. And so that's where I want to leave us for today. And the next two sessions are going to be developing a hermeneutic, proposing a hermeneutic that is largely built on these principles of faith, hope, and love. So I will see you next week. Because I don't see how you can ever end